Why narcissists can't stand your silence. Have you ever noticed how a narcissist seems more disturbed by your silence than by your anger? To them, silence is unbearable. They thrive on reaction, whether it's love, fear, or conflict. When you choose silence, you take away the fuel that feeds their ego. Psychologists explain that this absence of attention feels like suffocation, because without your response, they are forced to face their own emptiness. Silence threatens their illusion of control. Narcissists believe they can always provoke a reaction, no matter what. When you don't respond, it shatters their confidence. Psychologists call this narcissistic injury, a wound to their fragile self-image. Suddenly, they are no longer the center of your world. That realization cuts deeply, because their identity depends on keeping others entangled in their web. Your silence also denies them significance. Anger, arguments, and even tears confirm to them that they still matter. But silence says otherwise. Psychologists emphasize that indifference is more painful than hatred for narcissists. Hatred still means you're emotionally invested. Silence means you've let go. That quiet rejection echoes louder than words, reminding them they are no longer important in your life. Another reason narcissists can't stand your silence is because it exposes their weakness. They want to believe they are powerful enough to control your emotions. When you remain calm, it reflects their failure. Psychologists explain that this lack of reaction forces them to confront their limited power, and because they can't accept weakness, they twist in frustration, trying to find new ways to provoke you. Silence also leaves them alone with their thoughts. During the day, they may distract themselves with noise and people, but when your voice is absent, their mind grows restless. Psychologists call this exposure to inner void. Without your energy to focus on, their emptiness surfaces. That hollowness is unbearable, and your silence makes it louder, forcing them into discomfort they work hard to avoid. They can't stand silence because it strips away their mask. Narcissists depend on others to confirm their false image. When you don't respond, the mirror they use to polish their persona disappears. Psychologists say this lack of reflection destabilizes them. They are left with nothing but their true self, which they fear and despise. Silence confronts them with the very identity they try to hide. Silence also blocks their favorite tactic, manipulation. Narcissists rely on emotional hooks, guilt trips, charm, threats, to pull you back in. But if you don't respond, none of it works. Psychologists call this breaking the cycle of reinforcement. Without your reaction, they are powerless. That loss of control drives them restless, because their carefully crafted tools no longer achieve the result they crave. Another reason silence is unbearable is because it prevents them from rewriting the story. Narcissists often try to distort reality, making themselves the hero or the victim. But silence denies them that dialogue. Psychologists emphasize that silence protects your truth. Without your participation, their version of events feels incomplete. They may shout their story louder, but your refusal to engage keeps their lies fragile. Silence also signals strength. To a narcissist, your refusal to respond proves you've grown beyond their grasp. Psychologists highlight that survivors often reclaim power through silence. For narcissists, this is intolerable. They need to believe you are weak without them. But every quiet moment shows the opposite, that you're healing, standing strong, and no longer available as their source of control. Perhaps the deepest reason they can't stand silence is that it symbolizes freedom. Your silence means you've stepped out of their chaos and chosen peace. Psychologists describe this as reclaiming autonomy. For narcissists, nothing is more painful than seeing you free. In their world, freedom equals defeat. That's why your silence shakes them more than any confrontation ever could. Narcissists also hate silence because it destroys their sense of superiority. They rely on your reactions to feel above you. Every tear, every argument, every plea confirms their power, but silence flips the dynamic. Psychologists explain that your quiet refusal to engage levels the playing field. It shows you no longer fear them. This loss of superiority unsettles them and keeps them grasping for control. Your silence also makes them question their image. Narcissists are obsessed with appearances, and your lack of response hints that you see through their mask. Psychologists call this exposure anxiety. They fear that if you don't validate their false self, others might not either. At night, this thought gnaws at them. What if they're telling people the truth about me? Silence plants seeds of insecurity. They also despise silence because it removes the drama. Narcissists thrive on conflict. Chaos is their comfort zone because it keeps you emotionally entangled. When you stay silent, the stage goes empty. Psychologists highlight that, without drama, they are left with boredom and emptiness. Silence starves their need for chaos, and this absence feels like suffocation to someone addicted to attention. Silence also forces them to imagine what you're doing. Narcissists crave certainty and control, but silence leaves them in the dark. Psychologists describe this as uncertainty intolerance. They lie awake, picturing your new life, your new strength, or even a new love. Their imagination torments them more than reality. The lack of answers makes them restless, proving silence is more powerful than confrontation. Another reason silence is intolerable is because it blocks triangulation. Narcissists often use others to get reactions by comparing you to someone else, flaunting new relationships or seeking pity. But your refusal to engage breaks the chain. Psychologists explain that triangulation collapses without participation. Silence denies them the stage they need to manipulate, leaving them frustrated, powerless, and desperate to regain an audience. They can't stand silence because it reveals the truth of the relationship. Narcissists want to believe you'll always need them, but silence proves you can live without their chaos. Psychologists emphasize that silence is proof of recovery. Every day you don't react confirms their illusion of indispensability was false. For them, this truth is unbearable, because it dismantles the story they told themselves. Silence also blocks their favorite tactic, guilt. Narcissists thrive on making you feel responsible for their moods and failures. But guilt requires dialogue. Psychologists call this emotional bait. Without your response, the bait is useless. They can no longer push the buttons that once worked. Your silence breaks the chain of guilt, leaving them frustrated, pacing, and desperate to reclaim the control they've lost. They also despise silence because it exposes their dependence on you. Narcissists like to act superior, but silence forces them to face the truth. They needed your energy to feel whole. Psychologists describe this as supply starvation. Without your voice, your emotions, your presence, they feel empty. Silence reminds them that despite all their arrogance, they were the dependent one all along. Silence robs them of validation. Narcissists don't process emotions the way healthy people do. Instead, they rely on external validation to regulate themselves. Psychologists note that silence removes this lifeline. Without feedback, they spiral into insecurity and rage. They may lash out, seek attention elsewhere, or collapse into self-pity. All of this reveals how fragile they truly are when faced with quiet resistance. Finally, silence is a boundary they can't break. Narcissists despise boundaries because they limit access to control. Psychologists explain that silence is one of the strongest boundaries survivors can set. Each unanswered call, each ignored message, each quiet refusal to engage reinforces your independence. For narcissists, this is intolerable. They can't stand silence because it is the sound of you taking back your power. Narcissists also hate silence because it robs them of their audience. They crave spectators who admire their victories or pity their struggles. Your silence removes their stage. Psychologists call this loss of supply withdrawal. Without you reacting, they're left with emptiness. The quiet is unbearable because it proves their power was never as large as they believed. It existed only when you played along. Your silence also triggers paranoia. They begin to wonder what you're thinking, who you're talking to, and whether you're sharing their secrets. Psychologists highlight that uncertainty fuels their anxiety. The less you say, the more their imagination torments them. They picture scenarios where you are thriving, exposing them, or forgetting them entirely. This paranoia keeps them restless. proving silence is the ultimate weapon. Silence denies them closure on their terms. Narcissists want to control how the story ends. They may want to break you down until you leave in pieces, or lure you back for another cycle. Your silence interrupts that script. Psychologists explain that silence rewrites the ending. It puts you in charge. For narcissists, losing control of the ending is intolerable, keeping them obsessing long after you're gone. They can't stand silence because it is proof that manipulation no longer works. They may send apologies, threats, or baiting messages. But when you don't respond, they're forced to face the futility of their tactics. Psychologists call this narcissistic collapse, a moment when their strategies fail. Silence delivers that collapse more powerfully than confrontation ever could. Another reason silence disturbs them is because it makes them feel exposed. Without your participation, the cracks in their mask become visible to others. Psychologists note that silence shifts attention away from their performance and toward your calm strength. The contrast highlights their instability. In their eyes, every quiet day you live in peace is another day they lose credibility. They also despise silence because it's permanent in a way words are not. Arguments can be twisted, apologies manipulated, promises broken, but silence stands firm. Psychologists explain that silence removes negotiation. It cannot be redefined or reinterpreted. This permanence unsettles narcissists because it represents a power they cannot bend, twist, or control. Narcissists hate silence because it keeps them guessing. They rely on predictability to manipulate, but silence breaks that pattern. Psychologists call this uncertainty exposure. Without knowing what you think, they lose their ability to strategize. The guessing game becomes torture, filling their nights with restless what-ifs. Each unanswered question is a reminder that they no longer direct the script. Silence also exposes the fragility of their ego. They want to believe they are unforgettable, irreplaceable, and essential. But your silence proves otherwise. Psychologists explain that silence confronts them with their deepest fear. Irrelevance. The absence of your voice says louder than words. You no longer matter to me. This truth is unbearable, which is why they fight so hard against quiet rejection. They can't stand silence because it ruins their image of superiority. Narcissists thrive on comparison, needing to look stronger, happier, or more successful than you. But silence denies them that competition. Psychologists emphasize that your refusal to engage leaves them competing with themselves. Without you as a mirror, their grand illusions collapse. They're left battling insecurity in the quiet they cannot control. Finally, silence feels like punishment to them. Narcissists interpret your quiet as rejection, abandonment, and disrespect all at once. Psychologists explain that silence activates their childhood wounds of neglect. But instead of facing these wounds, they lash out or scramble for attention. What they don't realize is that your silence isn't punishment, it's protection. It's you reclaiming peace while they remain trapped in noise. Narcissists can't stand silence because it steals their ability to play the victim. They rely on twisting stories and drawing sympathy. But your refusal to engage leaves them with no script. Psychologists explain that silence denies them the chance to manipulate emotions through pity. Without your responses, their victim act loses its audience, and they are left exposed as the source of the chaos. Silence also cuts off their energy source. Every sigh, every text, every confrontation once fed their ego. Now, there is nothing. Psychologists call this narcissistic starvation. Without emotional food, they spiral into irritability, anger, and restlessness. Silence is not just absence, it is deprivation, forcing them to face their own emptiness without the distraction of your energy. They also despise silence because it forces them to watch your growth from a distance. Narcissists fear that your healing will prove they never had the power they claimed. Psychologists explain that seeing you thrive in silence highlights their inability to truly break you. This thought unsettles them because it proves your strength came from within, not from their influence. Silence takes away their weapon of confusion. Narcissists thrive on gaslighting, twisting your reality until you doubt yourself. But without communication, they cannot distort your truth. Psychologists note that silence anchors your clarity. Every day you don't engage strengthens your grip on reality, while their power to confuse fades. This clarity terrifies them, because they know the lies won't work anymore. Narcissists also hate silence because it dismantles their sense of control over time. They believe they can outlast you, but every quiet day proves otherwise. Psychologists emphasize that silence builds momentum in healing. Each unanswered attempt reminds them that their timeline of power is finished. The longer the silence lasts, the weaker their grip becomes, and that realization keeps them agitated. They can't stand silence because it exposes their emotional immaturity. While you learn to sit with peace, they crumble without chaos. Psychologists highlight that mature individuals can process loss and move forward, but narcissists cannot. Silence magnifies this difference. It shows who is growing and who is stuck. To them, your calm highlights their instability, and the comparison is unbearable. Another reason silence shakes them is because it denies them predictability. Narcissists rely on patterns: you reacting, you arguing, you returning. Silence breaks that cycle. Psychologists describe this as pattern disruption. Without knowing what comes next, they feel powerless. The unpredictability keeps them restless, because in their mind, not knowing is worse than bad news. Silence robs them of the script they cling to. Silence also confronts them with reality. Narcissists live in illusions, convincing themselves they are adored, envied, or feared. But your silence refuses to play along. Psychologists note that silence becomes a mirror that reflects truth. They don't control you anymore. That reflection shatters their fantasy, leaving them awake at night, trying to rebuild illusions that no longer hold power. They can't stand silence, because it strips away attention from their theatrics. Every dramatic post, every staged smile, every exaggerated success relies on your gaze. But silence means you're not watching. Psychologists explain that silence removes the audience they crave. Without attention, their performances lose meaning, leaving them deflated and scrambling to find validation elsewhere. Finally, silence is unbearable to them, because it is the one thing they cannot manipulate. They can twist words, distort truths, and exploit emotions, but they cannot control the absence of response. Psychologists call this the unbreakable boundary. Silence stands firm, immune to their tactics, and in that quiet, they realize the most painful truth of all. They have lost control, and they cannot win it back. Narcissists also despise silence, because it removes their ability to bait you. They thrive on sending messages, flaunting relationships, or spreading rumors just to provoke a reaction. But when you respond with nothing, their hooks fall flat. Psychologists explain that silence disarms manipulation. It leaves the narcissist pacing, restless, and increasingly desperate to regain the attention they once took for granted. Silence also denies them closure on their terms. They want to be the one who decides when things end, how they end, and what you remember. But your silence rewrites the script. Psychologists emphasize that silence closes the door permanently. It leaves them powerless to dictate the ending, forcing them to accept a truth they never wanted to face. You ended the story, not them. They can't stand silence because it shows you are no longer afraid. Fear was once their greatest weapon. Threats, guilt, and anger kept you bound. But silence reveals courage. Psychologists highlight that survivors reclaim strength by refusing to engage. For narcissists, this reversal is unbearable. The very thing they used to control you no longer works, and your silence proves their reign is over. Another reason silence unsettles them is because it confronts them with loss. Narcissists deny loss by replacing partners, flaunting success, or rewriting history. But silence cannot be erased. Psychologists explain that silence represents permanence. Every day you don't respond is a reminder that their control has truly ended. This permanence gnaws at them, turning silence into their most painful reality. They also hate silence because it leaves them irrelevant. Narcissists crave significance, but silence says clearly, you no longer matter here. Psychologists describe irrelevance as one of their deepest fears. Without your attention, they fade into the background. No matter how loudly they perform, your quiet absence overshadows their noise, and that irrelevance feels like the ultimate defeat. Silence forces them to confront themselves. Narcissists spend their lives running from their own emptiness, hiding behind control and drama. But silence is a mirror. Psychologists explain that in the absence of your voice, they must face their own. And what they find is not strength, but fragility. This confrontation is intolerable, which is why they fight so hard to break your quiet boundary. They can't stand silence, because it reveals who truly holds the power. For so long, they convinced themselves it was them, but silence shifts the balance. Psychologists emphasize that real power is calm, not chaos. In your silence, you prove that peace is stronger than manipulation. This reversal terrifies them, because it proves they were never as powerful as they believed. Silence also exposes the truth of the relationship. It wasn't love, it was control. Psychologists remind us that when survivors choose silence, they reclaim clarity. Narcissists cannot tolerate this clarity, because it unmasks the entire illusion. They wanted you entangled forever, but silence says, "I see clearly now." This truth pierces them deeper than anger ever could. Another unbearable aspect of silence is its finality. Arguments can reopen doors, but silence seals them shut. Psychologists describe silence as the ultimate boundary. For narcissists, this is torture, because they thrive on cycles of return. Silence breaks the cycle. It tells them the chapter is closed, leaving them powerless to start it again. In conclusion, narcissists can't stand your silence because it starves them of attention, destroys their illusions, and exposes their weakness. Silence is not empty. It is powerful. Psychologists affirm that your refusal to respond is your greatest strength. It protects your peace, reclaims your autonomy, and shows that freedom is possible. Their noise will always crumble against your quiet strength. Your silence is the final word. A narcissist can't stand your silence because it strips away their control, their illusions, and their false power. But remember, your silence isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the proof that you've chosen peace over chaos, freedom over manipulation. If this message gave you clarity, share it with someone who needs the same reminder today. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join this community where your healing, your peace, and your voice truly matter.